I started to work at Castle Howard because I came round as a visitor and I had some questions about the house which nobody could answer. So I wrote to the family and said, I don't suppose you would like somebody to come and work in the house for you? And they said yes, and that was 35 years ago. So in 35 years I have learnt everything about Castle Howard.
So at that time, was it Simon already, or
George? It was Simon's father,
George Howard.
George Howard. So I've worked with George Howard, Simon Howard, and Nick Howard.
So which year is Simon become the chairman of this?
Simon became the chairman in 1985.
So when did you start that?
I started in 1983.
But at that time, you already studied a lot of history.
I was doing a PhD at York University.
Oh, right, okay. Which year is that?
My PhD was from 1981 to 1984.
So is it relevant to Castle Howard or any history?
No. I was studying English literature.
Oh, it's a PhD in English literature.
Yeah.
But you love history.
I love history, art. I'm curious about everything. So I like to explore history, art, architecture, landscape, literature, music, sculpture, everything.
So when you first started the career in Castle Howard, what did you do?
The first thing I did was to work on the library here and the book collection, which is enormous, and help catalogue and organise that. But from there, one thing led to another, to another, to another. So all the time I'm learning about the history of Castle Howard, indoors and outdoors, and I become more and more involved in different aspects of Castle Howard. So it will be research.
So what subjects are you doing?
Well, the research here will be what do we need to know about Castle Howard? It might be researching the architecture, the landscape, or the collections, so that we can present Castle Howard to the public, so that they have true and accurate information about Castle Howard. But it might be research of a more technical nature. We want to restore this lake, we want to restore this part of the building. What do the archives and the documents that are held here tell us about this in the past?
What sort of projects have you done during this time? Important projects or...
The major restoration projects have been all of the lakes, fountains and waterways.
What did you do with them?
Well, they were in disrepair, overgrown, not working, so we wanted to make all the waterworks function, but we needed to recover them. They were all overgrown, so we had to find the original shapes of the ponds and the waterways and make them into good working order, but so that they reflected what they looked like in the 18th century. So we tried to make them true to how they used to look in the 18th century.
But what is your role in these projects?
My role in these projects will be to examine all the historical information, and then how do we apply that historical knowledge to the practical issues of restoration. But it's not just the practical issues like the work involved, but also what is our conservation philosophy. I'm looking at it from a higher level.
Yeah.
So we might be planning the costings of it, reviewing the budget, and making sure that the operation is both on time, but is also true to what we set out to do.
How long is that project of restoration of all the lakes fountains?
That took 6 years.
Roughly how much is the budget?
For that, the operation cost, and this is 20 years ago, but it was £160,000.
Yeah, but that was in 80s.
That was late 80s,
late
early
80s.
90s.
Has the Castle Howard got any funding, public fundings, or purely depending on the gate's income?
Funding for restoration projects comes from two different sources. One, we try to generate the funds from our own income, and our income comes from visitors, but also the wider estate, the farming and the forestry, and the lakeside holiday park. So we generate income, but it's not enough to do these restoration projects. So where we can, we apply for grants. And when you apply for grants, that's something I'm involved in writing the grant applications. And people who award the grants want to be confident that you know what you're talking about, that your decisions are historically informed and you're not making it up. So that's why the research is very important if you're going to unlock the funding to help you in these projects.
Yeah, it sounds to me very important. But what about these two types of funding resource, their percentage? A half-half?
If you have a grant, it's usually a half-half. It's a matching grant. So 50-50, 60-40 if you're lucky.
So any other projects after the late 80s, after that 6 years?
Yes, there have been many. One would be all the lead sculpture outdoors. There were 18 full-size figures from the 18th century. Each of these was restored and repaired. That was a project that lasted 5 years.
That was recent, right? Not long ago.
That was the late 90s, early 2000s.
So how many years do you think these sculptures need to be restored again?
Well, one had to be restored very recently because in the winter there was a storm and a tree fell on it, so it had to be repaired. But they should be good for the next 50 years.
So every sculpture need to be taken off, and was it repaired on site in Castle Howard?
Yes, in a workshop on site. Yeah. So I worked with the conservator and I researched the history of these sculptures, what they meant. So for example, we were able to find that once upon a time these sculptures had been painted white because it was a fashion to make them look like marble. Yeah. But we made the decision that we would not paint them white, we would keep them lead. So this was a conservation decision that you could only make with historical information. I might mention the most recent project.
Oh yes,
is replanting the trees in the avenue.
Yes, that's right. That's the most recent one. That was last year, right?
Well, it was 2014 to 2018. It was
yes.
a 4-year project that finished this year.
I read on the news it's about the some of the trees has got disease.
Yeah.
So what sort of disease and what's the reason for that?
Well, many trees get diseases and more trees get more diseases. It's a fact of life. It's to do with climate change or globalization. But these are lime trees and they are prone to a particular disease called Kretschmaria. You don't need the full, but it means that they rot from within. Yeah. So they become unstable and dangerous. So if they fall, they might kill somebody or hurt somebody. So many of these trees needed to be chopped down because they were dangerous.
How did you firstly notice the problem?
A tree expert would identify that for you.
Okay.
But what we had to decide was, did we fell only parts of the avenue, or would we have made a radical decision to fell all of the avenue and replant the whole thing from new? This was one of the options that we had.
So you are researching on this project especially
Yes,
to make the decision.
because what is very important is that when you grow an avenue of trees, you want the trees to be mature at the same time, so they're the same height, the same thickness. But if you selectively plant, you have a mature tree and then a tiny tree. And we had to make a decision what looked aesthetically best, but also what could we afford, because we had a grant, but it would not have covered felling all of the avenue. So we wanted to do select felling and select replanting, but in a way that encouraged the new trees to grow in as better way as possible. Other things I do here, I have over 30 years organised exhibitions inside the house. So these will be exhibitions about the history of Castle Howard or its collections, and those I do perhaps every 3 years as a different exhibition.
So what topics do you cover in your lectures in the universities or to the public?
I talk on a wide range of subjects. They are usually around one aspect of Castle Howard. They might be on the architecture or the art collections or the landscape or the history of parts of the house or the family. But also I talk a lot on restoration and conservation, and all the projects that we have done. I explain how we went about these projects, the beginning, the middle, the end, the challenges, the difficulties, the successes, the costs and things like that. So they are, as it were, practical talks about the realities of conservation and restoration.
So many topics. Do you publish books on these topics?
I have published various books and presentations on the landscape, on architecture, and on the art collections here. So this is one of the books I've published, which came out of a conference I held, which is all on designed landscape in the 18th century in England, and Castle Howard is central to this.
So about this design, is it you talk about why they put in this design in the past, or how they developed?
The Castle Howard Gardens are very famous for their design in the early 18th century. They were different because they didn't follow the rule of geometry. They liked to be informal and irregular, and this was a new fashion in the 18th century. And Castle Howard is really at the beginning of that trend in English landscape garden design.
So what is the traditional English garden design? Is it sort of geometry, like squares or symmetrical?
In the 17th century, yes, geometry and squares, but in the 18th century, increasing informality and irregularity. And the point is that Castle Howard is the transition moment in those changing fashions. Throughout garden history in England, there tends to be a period of formal, informal, formal, informal, and Castle Howard had Victorian gardens that were formal. But the designed landscape, the famous landscape that is spread out over so many acres of land, is famous because it is informal. It doesn't run to a rule of geometry.
So how large is the Castle Howard garden?
Well, the estate itself, the Castle Howard estate, is 9,000 acres, of which 2/3 of that will be farmland and woodland, but about 2,000 acres is garden and parkland.
It seems a very massive place. So how many gardeners normally working?
Well, today we have maybe a gardening team in the summer of 10 people. 150 years ago you had 40 or 50 gardeners, but today machinery can do many of those jobs. The thing about the Castle Howard Gardens is that they are big, but they also varied, so that you have grass lawns, you have flowers, a walled garden, you will have a lake, you will have a terrace, you'll have wood. There are very different areas that you can enjoy and experience. One 18th century visitor came here and was so amazed by the gardens that he said that when you visit the Castle Howard garden, it is not one garden, it is 10 different gardens. There are so many different aspects to it.
How many monuments or landmarks in this 2,000-acre garden?
Well, there are at least 8. You have a temple, a pyramid, a mausoleum, 2 fountains, an obelisk, a gatehouse, a medieval fortification, and several other objects too, where on that obelisk, which is the tall shaft in the middle of the road, that is, all of these date from the beginning of the 18th century when the 3rd Earl of Carlisle built Castle Howard.
Okay. Is that the sign of the Earl of Carlisle?
The obelisk isn't, no. I mean, but there is an inscription on that which he writes saying, these are the works that I have done in laying out the landscape here. Because Castle Howard is very important for architectural heritage, the buildings, the monuments, but it is also very important for the natural heritage, the woodlands, the lakes, the waters, and the wildlife too.
So how do you describe the conservation or restoration of Castle Howard? It's constant work.
It is constant work. We can never stand still. There are more jobs than we can do in a lifetime. Because big buildings, old big buildings, always have problems. So the stonework is suffering from damp or frost or age. Windows need replacing. Lead roofs need replacing. Even trees need replacing. Many people think trees go on forever and ever, but they need replacing too. So we have, when we wrote the Conservation Management Plan in 2008, which won a national award, we identified restoration projects that totaled in the order of £24 million to do.
So if you just give an order of like the top 3 challenges of the conservation, what would they be?
The 3 most pressing areas at the moment, bearing in mind that might change, are the mausoleum, which probably will cost £10 million to put right.
So what is the problem with the mausoleum?
Stone decay, water damage. It needs to be secured. The other major area would be the stonework and the roof of parts of the castle itself, which need replacing, renewing. The third one is more specific. There is an area of the house where we have discovered a problem that we did not know about before in the roof space with beetle damage and woodworm. And this is a problem, is that we may plan strategically for lots of projects and budget for them, but suddenly you discover something you didn't know before, so you have to revise your plan because something is urgent and must go to the top of the list.
How important Castle Howard is to the England heritage?
Well, I would say Castle Howard is the most important piece of heritage in England, but Castle Howard is easily in the top 5 most important historic houses in England. It is special because of its architecture, its landscape, and its long history lived in by the same family since it was built.